Good evening and welcome. My name is Ben Tudelo and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Geosciences in the Faculty of Science and the Gallagher Colloquium series lead. Thank you for joining us online for this evening's Gallagher Colloquium lecture. We are recording today's session and we'll be posting this video on the Faculty of Science website. I encourage you to check our website, science.ucalgary.ca, for event listings and video updates. Just a reminder, should our webinar become disconnected before the event ends, allow us a minute to restart the session. You'll be able to rejoin the webinar just by using the same login link that you used to get here in the first place. Hosting this year's series online provides us with a greater opportunity to engage with attendees from around the globe. As we gather this evening, I like to think about who I'm sharing this virtual space with now, both near and far. We are broadcasting from Calgary, which is located on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. The University of Calgary is situated on land adjacent to where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, and the traditional Blackfoot name of this place is Mohkinstsis, which we now call the city of Calgary. Before we begin tonight's presentation, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the Gallagher family for making this series possible. Through their generous philanthropy and vision for deep connection between the university and the community, the Gallagher family has provided the Department of Geoscience and the Faculty of Science with the opportunity to develop and grow the Gallagher Colloquium series. To strengthen our scientific community by increasing scientific knowledge, creating public awareness, and establishing connections with our alumni, community, students, faculty, and staff. Thank you, Tom and Fred Gallagher, for your continued support of this public lecture series and for being champions of science. The Gallagher Colloquium series continues to be an invaluable way to connect science with our community and our community with science. And I think that the subject of tonight's lecture really gets to the very heart of the exciting and dynamic nature of geoscience in the 21st century. I'd like to invite Dr. Kathy Ryan, Associate Dean Research and Graduate Education in the Faculty of Science, to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thanks so much, Ben. It's such a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to introduce Paul Bauman to you, who I've known for about 30 years, both professionally and personally, including his wonderful family, some of whom I'm sure have joined us tonight. So I'll start like we usually do with Paul's undergrad. And for Paul's undergrad, he elected to go to a local university close to where he grew up, which just happened to be Princeton. And while at Princeton, he did an undergraduate degree in geological engineering with a focus on water resources. And he also did a minor that I'll refer back to in my introduction, along with his engineering degree, and that was in Near Eastern Studies, which is a program that still exists at Princeton and has a diverse curricula that includes history, literature, religion, anthropology, and the study of one or more Near Eastern languages. So after Paul finished his bachelor's in his geological engineering degree, he took a position as a field engineer with the International Drilling and Oilfield Services Company, Schlumberger, and he worked for them between 1981 and 1986 in the same Near Eastern region that he studied in his minor. And so he worked in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Papua New Guinea. While he was working for Schlumberger, Paul obviously picked up the power of geophysics. And he chose then for his master's degree to combine his water resources from his undergraduate and geophysics to do a master's of science in earth sciences at the University of Waterloo, which is where I first met him. And he conducted his MSc research in the use of environmental geophysics, which really didn't exist as a field at that time, to look at dense oily chemicals in the subsurface. Along the way, Paul and I had the opportunity to do some outdoor trips together, and I can confirm to you that he is every bit as intense in the field as he is in conversation over lunch. In truth, I'm not sure if Paul ever sleeps. And so when Paul graduated from the University of Waterloo, he may have been one of the first geoscientists in North America that was cross-trained as a hydrogeologist and an environmental geophysicist. And then he left Eastern Canada and he started working with a small company here in Calgary known as COMEX, which was mostly hydrogeologists. And Paul set up shop with them as one of the first environmental geophysicists in Canada. And he really led the way, in my view, in showing what environmental geophysics could offer, not just to hydrogeology, but to environmental geosciences more generally. So while Paul's day job was in environmental geophysics, I don't think he ever really left his interest in Near Eastern studies far behind. And in Alberta, he did some early work using geophysics to look at archaeological investigations, including, for example, TP rings in southern Alberta. And then, as Paul tells it, one day he took a call from a prominent archaeologist, Richard Freund, who opened their telephone conversation with the question of whether or not Paul wanted to join an expedition in Israel to search for the Ark of the Lost Covenant. And when Paul came back from that field work and explained what he did there, I couldn't believe how well suited he was to this kind of work, because you see, Paul's not just a field geophysicist with hydrogeology training. He is a person who can crawl around in caves all day and actually enjoy it, literally rappel off a cliff at the end of his field work as required, process data in the early evening, and plan for the next field day's field work in the late evening. On top of this, not only did he have all of these technical skills, he had also studied the history of the region in his undergrad minor and knew about the archaeology, and he speaks Hebrew. So Paul's done lots more of archaeological campaigns that we won't hear about this evening, ranging from looking for ancient burial sites to Holocaust escape tunnels to the city of Atlantis. And you can see lots of this work on various documentaries. And then sometime in the late 1990s, when Paul and I both had young families, back in the day when we had landlines and voicemail, I picked up repetitive voicemails from Paul and then a couple of hang-ups. And so I knew that he wanted to talk to me about something important. And when I called him back, he opened the conversation with, "Kathy, I have the offer of a lifetime, but I can't do it." And so what's up, Paul? So UNICEF was calling Paul at this point to help look for fresh water for coastal communities in Indonesia that had been truly devastated after the 2004 tsunami on Boxing Day. And Paul explained to me how much he would love to do this work, but how he couldn't see how he could leave Leslie with their young kids to go to Indonesia for the months-long contract that UNICEF was asking for. So it was easy for me to point out the obvious. Who else, Paul, in the whole world could be better suited for this job? So what environmental geophysicist could UNICEF find who would have Paul's unique combination of technical skills, the fortitude and resilience to set up a field exploration program in a remote region with no services because it had literally just been devastated, spoke Indonesian, and also had cultural understanding to work there effectively. So I gave Paul some free advice, which was to talk to Leslie about how much time their family could manage without their dad, and tell UNICEF what his terms were. And I think that worked out well for everybody involved. And then Paul added humanitarian to his hydrogeophysicist job title. Since then, Paul has literally traveled the world with his work that has involved fascinating projects in wonderful landscapes. He not only conducts outstanding technical projects, but he and his daughter Josie, who's worked with him, also takes fabulous photographs, some of which I'm sure we'll see tonight, and he tells great stories. So I don't think we'll hear this evening about archaeological investigations or some of the amazing innovative work that Paul has shown over his career, which has moved from that small firm of COMEX, which used to be on the Trans-Canada in Montgomery and Calgary, to Worley Parsons, then to Vizian, and most recently to BGC Engineering. But Paul's innovation has included the likes of kite photography and waterborne geophysics on prairie rivers. So I think, though, after this long career that Paul has had, that his favorite projects are those in which he makes a humanitarian contribution, and that's what we'll hear about tonight. And I invite you all to join me in thanking the Gallagher family and the Canadian Society of Exploration Geophysicists for the opportunity to welcome Paul to speak with us this evening. Over to you, Paul.
Great. Thank you very much, Kathy, for that very gracious introduction. I certainly hope I can return the favor someday. So when I first arrived in Calgary 31 years ago, I was new to the city. I remember very distinctly driving around the city and a little bit lost, listening to the radio, and there was a CBC program. It was a first part of a two-part interview with Jack Gallagher. And I imagine many people coming out of the oil patch remember the second part, but the first part was amazing. It was about the beginning of his career, and it was absolutely riveting. And he began his career in North Africa, in Egypt, and it was 1939, and World War II was just beginning. He was working for Shell Oil. Shell pulled out, and he stayed, and he worked for Standard Oil, and then he was seconded to the British Army, and the British Army thought they might be retreating across the Sinai Desert, so they had Jack Gallagher exploring for water in the Sinai. And most people who know me, including Kathy, would never call me Smiling Paul Bauman, but in the Sinai Desert is where we're going to begin this talk today. And after my junior year at Princeton University, where I was majoring in geological engineering, I knew I wanted to stay in the geosciences, but I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. So this is 1979, and I was able to line up an internship in the Sinai Desert, that triangle of land between Africa and Israel. I was working on a metamorphic mapping project. And of all the experiences I had in Sinai, what made the greatest impression on me was not the incredible tectonics that are on full display on the desert or the coral reefs, but what made the greatest impression on me was the Bedouins, the nomads. And these nomads, of course, they didn't have an Ivy League degree or any education of any sort, but nevertheless, they seemed to have an uncanny, surefire ability to know where to dig their water wells. And I had no idea. But after many campfires and many cups of far too sweet tea, I eventually was able to understand that what they were doing was using their observational powers and their traditional knowledge. So for instance, they would look at the darker colored dikes, the black dikes, and look at the angle of those dikes and how they cut across the wadis. And they knew, for instance, that the darker colored dikes were unweathered. They would act as underground dams and raise the water table. And I mentioned this one evening to one of the geologists at the camp. And after the program, he gave me a compendium of papers that the Israeli survey had done in the Sinai. And one of these papers used geophysical methods as they existed 40 years ago to essentially mimic what the Bedouins were doing in their water exploration. And since then, I've been hooked on this non-intrusive investigation of the subsurface, and in particular, water exploration. And it's certainly taken me to many remote places in the world, including some places I had never heard of, but some of these had already been visited by people far more famous than myself. And we'll begin in one of those places, the Kakuma refugee camp. And it was here Angelina Jolie and Reese Witherspoon had previously spent quite a bit of time. But of the three of us, only two of us, Reese Witherspoon and myself, only the two of us have made a movie. Reese Witherspoon made the 2014 excellent Hollywood movie with actual Kakuma refugees in it, The Good Lie, and a short documentary, Finding Water, was made about the water project, about which I'll be speaking on the first few minutes. But we'll be mentioning Angelina Jolie a few minutes later into the talk. The Kakuma refugee camp was established 1991, 1992 for the 30 to 40,000 lost boys from southern Sudan who spent 1, 2, 3 years crossing the deserts, jungles, wetlands of southern Sudan to Ethiopia, and then fled civil war in Ethiopia to come to the border of Kenya. And that from there, they were trucked and bused 100 kilometers south to the Turkana Desert, to what is the middle of nowhere. And nowhere, in fact, is one of the Turkana translations for the word Kakuma. This Kakuma 4, the first part of the camp was Kakuma 1, then expanded 2, 3, and 4. Now, generally, a lot of us may believe from the media that all these refugees, they're coming to Canada, they're coming to the States, they're coming to France, but that's not the case. Generally, most of the refugees in the world, they're fleeing marginalized lands, arid lands suffering from political upheavals, desertification, climate change, and they're walking out of these places usually to adjacent countries that are just marginally better off. And they're usually being placed in the arid and semi-arid places in those countries. So Kenya, for instance, is the country that hosts the 5th largest number of refugees, with over 500,000 refugees. And 200,000 of them are in the Kakuma camp, with 60% of them being from the world's newest country, what's now South Sudan, another 20% fleeing civil war, famine, drought in Somalia, and the other 20% fleeing political upheavals, climate change stress from Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Yemen, the Congo, and so forth. So here's a portion of the camp. The camp is located on a plain, on a basin called the Lodokipi Basin. It's rimmed in the south by volcanic mountains. And of course, that basin, the Lodokipi Plain, it's infilled with silts, sands, and clays, but also as it's part of the East African Rift Valley, actually the eastern arm of the East African Rift Valley. It's a closed basin. So there are also a lot of salt deposits that are churned up by flash floods and paleo wadis and creating a number of salinized aquifers. The sediment, because we're on the south end of the basin, the sediment thickness varies from a fraction of a meter to many tens of meters. The sediment overlies volcanic rock. Those volcanics overlie a thin sedimentary layer that in turn overlies the crystalline basement. And then that's all overprinted by intense block faulting. And again, we're in the Rift Valley. So very complex geology. So here's a simplified geological map on the left of Kenya. And we can see that Kakuma is at the northern end of that peach-colored south to north lineament. That's the east arm of the East African Rift Valley. But the southern end of that blue semicircle, the Lodokipi Basin, the sediment basin. Now in 2016, when we carried out our water exploration program, at that point in time, UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission of Refugees, was supplying the camp with 12 wells. All of those wells were drilled and screened into the underlying volcanics, producing water from the weathered volcanics. They produce variable amounts of water, but they all produce water with fluoride concentrations at above or way above the Canadian WHO and Kenyan drinking water standard of 1.5 milligrams per liter. Generally, it's understood that the fluoride comes out of the dissolution from alkaline volcanics in the Rift Valley. So the wells pump the water out of the ground. They pump for 10 hours at night. The water is immediately chlorinated before it goes into these 6 or so 100 cubic meter overhead tanks that are distributed about the camp. And then the following day, for a few hours in the afternoon and a few hours in the morning, the water is distributed to hundreds of tap stands scattered about the camp by gravity, hopefully, if everything works well. So refugees, mostly young children, mostly young girls, line up in the early morning hours, often before dawn, with their jerry cans, hoping to get water, hoping not to be physically abused, hoping not to be raped, hoping to get their water back home and go to school that the UN provides. So needless to say, many of them become discouraged. They go out into the ephemeral riverbeds, the wadis, what in the Turkana language they call lagers, and they dig these scoop holes. They scoop water out with whatever container they have. They fill up their containers and take off. The water, of course, is high in E. coli and very high in pathogens. And as bad as the water situation is for the refugees, it's even more dire for the Turkana people, whose lives revolve around taking their donkeys, camels, and goats from one ephemeral water source to another. So I'd been in the camp, in the Kakuma camp in 2014 and 2015 for a few weeks. I was teaching a training course to both refugees and host community Turkana, an introduction to hydrogeology, an introduction to groundwater at the camp, household treatment of water, introduction to basic geophysical exploration using 1D techniques. And through my time in the camp, I certainly got to see the water system up close, and I came to very two very clear conclusions. First, there wasn't nearly enough water. UNHCR targets in this desert environment 20 liters per person per day. And while I was there, the water supply was as low as 12 liters per person per day. And secondly, the water quality was poor, generally high in fluoride and quite often high in salinity as well. So I thought potentially I could improve on it. So in 2016, I came back to the camp with a few colleagues from Canada and a grant from Geoscientists Without Borders. And I put together an exploration crew using the students from my previous classes in 2014 and 2015. I'm going to introduce you to a couple of them. This first one is Loki Lowy, and she's a Turkana woman. And like all the refugees and all the people in the class, she spoke at least three languages. She spoke Turkana, English, and Kiswahili. She taught at the Angelina Jolie Primary School. This was a school Angelina Jolie had built and supports as an alternative to young girls to boarding school, an alternative to early childhood marriage and no education. Laban Losero, he was a child soldier from South Sudan. He spoke at least 4 languages. And he was very good with a machete, which actually came in handy. Junior Kayembe was 3 years into a geology degree in the Congo when civil war broke out. And he fled and came 1,000 kilometers by hitchhiking and truck to the Kakuma camp. And he speaks at least 5 languages. And he was recently resettled to the United States as a translator. So where were we going to find water? Well, I hypothesized, of course I didn't know, but I hypothesized that given that the camp, and here we're looking down at actually Kakuma 1, the first part of the camp, given that the camp is flanked by these 2 large wadis, these 2 large lagers, that likely, or at least perhaps, there'd be paleo channels underlying the camp that would connect to these lagers and would potentially be recharged from these lagers. Of course, I didn't know if these paleo channels were there, but if they were there, we were certainly hoping we could find them with geophysical methods. And if we could find them, there would be less expensive wells to drill because they would be more shallow versus the 50 to 150 volcanic, weathered volcanic wells that UNHCR was drilling. They would likely produce water with higher flow rates since they would be sands and gravels. And they would likely produce water with lower fluoride concentration. Again, because they're coming from the sands and gravels. But this was all hypothetical. We didn't know. But where was the water going to come from? Well, I knew from having been in the camp, and then in the fall and the spring, you get what are called the big rains and the small rains. And when you get rainfall, as you can see in this limited hydrograph of data that was available over a 6-7 month period, that when you get continuous rainfall for a few days, either over Kakuma or maybe up the drainage towards Uganda, you'll actually start to accumulate water in the lagers. You'll get flash flood. And as you can see below in the hydrographs, all of the UNHCR wells in the crystalline bed, in the weathered volcanics, respond immediately to these flash floods. So I guessed, hoped that overlying paleo channels, overlying gravels would also be recharged very quickly. So what was our approach? Well, we used 2 techniques. First, we used seismic refraction. In our 11-day field program, we collected 6 kilometers of seismic refraction data. And here, what we're mapping is quite simply the velocity of the subsurface. And generally, anywhere you go in the world, you can say overburden is slow, rock is fast. So by mapping the top of the high velocity zone, we could see where the bedrock was deepest, where the overburden was thickest. And then we collected 12 kilometers of 2D electrical resistivity tomography data. And here the purpose is to figure out, is that overburden conductive, that is low resistivity, is the blue and green colors you see here, so clay filled or saltwater saturated, or is it high resistivity, yellow and pink, and freshwater saturated sands and gravels. So this is the first section that UNHCR drilled a well on. It's a 800-meter long section, 70 meters deep. You can see the overburden thickness varies from 25 to 30 meters. That red dashed line is the top of rock, the 2,000 meter per second contour. We've stripped off of the refraction data. And then we see this hot pink blanket, this high resistivity layer that we interpreted as freshwater saturated sand and gravel. So UNHCR drilled the first well on our data here, Lucky Borehole 13. It was screened between 14 and 29 meters below ground surface. It was the shallowest well ever drilled in Kakuma. It was also one of the most highly productive wells ever drilled at 40 cubic meters per hour. And it was the first well ever drilled with fluoride concentrations below 1.5 milligrams per liter. UNHCR then followed with 2 more wells in nearby sands, and those were also good producers at 29 and 45 cubic meters per hour, also with low fluoride and low salinity. So how much water is this? To give you a better idea, you add these numbers together, you pump those flow rates for 10 hours a night, distribute it to the camp, target 20 liters per person per day. That's enough water for 60,000 refugees. All 3 of those wells are still producing today, and UNHCR has drilled 3 more wells based on the same model of targeting those shallow paleo channels. So how important is it, though, that the fluoride concentrations are below drinking water standards? I think we can all agree that finding water for refugees stuck in the middle of the desert is a good thing, but is it really important to meet this guideline of 1.5 milligrams per liter fluoride? Well, in 2018 and 2019, for the first time in the history of the camp, a small Israeli NGO established a dental clinic. And during each of those weeks, the dentist saw 200 patients. And as you can imagine, after 28 years with no dental care, they saw only extreme cases, all of which required extractions. And of the 400 patients they saw, up to 70% of those extractions were directly due to fluorosis. But can we really associate it with water in the camp? Well, in 2016, in February, immediately after coming back from Kakuma, on a cold February day, I met Annalie Coakley, the head of the Calgary Refugee Clinic, and a Somali refugee, Mohammed Hassan, in the basement of a coffee shop in Kensington. And Mohammed Hassan, he was in his 40s. He walked in with a cane. Annalie Coakley, Dr. Coakley, said he had the skeleton of the backbone of a 90-year-old. And not being much for small talk, I immediately asked Mohammed 2 questions. How long had you been in the camp? And he said 9 years. And where did you live in the camp? And he had lived for his entire 9 years in Block 6 and Block 4 of Zone 2 of Kakuma 2. Those areas are entirely dependent on Borehole 5. Borehole 5 has always had the highest fluoride concentrations. In 2016, it was almost 9 milligrams per liter, 6 times the drinking water standard. There was no question in my mind, even though he had showed negative on the typical urine fluoride test, there was no question in my mind he had fluorosis. Further tests, including a biopsy, proved this, a bone biopsy proved this, and the analyses of fluoride on Mohammed Hassan have since spoken for thousands of other refugees in that camp. So it's probably of no surprise to anyone that marginalized refugees are going to be put on marginal aquifers in the middle of the desert. What we're now seeing for the first time, largely thanks to the GRACE satellite data, is that it's not only these aquifers in arid terrain that are being stressed, but in fact, most of the aquifers in the world, the GRACE satellites tell us 2/3 of the large regional aquifers in the world are at or beyond their tipping points. And we're seeing this even in areas of high rainfall. So for instance, this is GRACE data, GRACE satellite data over the Indian subcontinent. GRACE satellites measure gravity. These warmer colors indicate gravity lows. That is where we've lost either ice or snow or water from groundwater. And if we look at that yellow box, that's over Bangladesh, one of the rainiest places in the world. It gets 50 billion cubic meters of groundwater recharge a year, but it withdraws 53 billion cubic meters. And if we follow that yellow arrow, it takes us to the Teknaf Peninsula. And the Teknaf Peninsula receives 3.8 meters of rainfall a year, twice the rainfall of Squamish. And it was here that more than 750,000 refugees came from the Rakhine province in Myanmar, fleeing ethnic cleansing and genocide. So following our success in Kakuma, UNHCR invited us in the fall of 2017 to carry out water exploration program in the refugee camps in the Teknaf Peninsula. And there were 5 camps we worked on, but the most challenging ones were the 2 later in Nayapara in the southern part of the peninsula that sits on top of these thick hundreds of meters of miocene shales, terrible aquifer material. In fact, we were able to find a number of incised sandstone units, but they were poor water. Wells were drilled and they did produce water, but not much, 4 or 5 cubic meters an hour. And really what you need in a big camp like this is 40 to 50 cubic meters an hour. At the same time, we were doing our deeper exploration program. Dozens of NGOs, UN agencies, church, religious organizations, in a completely uncoordinated, chaotic response, were drilling thousands. In November 2017, there were already 3,000 of these shallow suction pump wells drilled down to only 4 or 5 meters. And as you can see, they were so chaotic, you would simply have one well drilled to another. So needless to say, by the time the next dry season came around, all of these thousands of wells were dry. At the same time, these wells, of course, have no facility for chlorination, and they were put in place without any regard to sources of contamination, areas of open defecation, latrines, showers, overland runoff. And I was actually interviewed right here by BBC, and I unfortunately correctly predicted that a cholera outbreak would surely occur given the practices that were happening in the camp. So very, very discouraged from my experience in Bangladesh. I felt very fortunate a few months later to be in northern Uganda, again with another grant from Geoscientists Without Borders, this time carrying out a water exploration, water development program in an area where all the NGOs and UN agencies and other aid agencies had largely abandoned the area more than 10 years early. So this is Acholi land. And Acholi land from 2002 from 1982 to 2006 was the site of Africa's longest running civil war, where Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army waged war against the Museveni government. And in response, Yoweri Museveni, who just won the most recent election again in Uganda, he cleared the landscape of 2 million Acholi people, ostensibly to open up the battlefield, and put them in what he called protection camps. But these 251 protection camps were in fact concentration camps with the highest mortality rates of anywhere in the world. Over 1,000 people a week dying from Ebola, AIDS, dengue, malaria, cholera, and so forth. And it's not so long ago. You can see these in Google Earth. 2006, the camps began to be abandoned. Families, which at that point largely consisted of old women and young children, began returning to their villages. They had to rebuild their gardens, their houses, and of course, their water supplies. So where are we? Well, we haven't come that far from Kakuma, but we're in a completely different geological environment. We've moved 300 kilometers to the southwest to Acholi land. Gulu is the largest town in that area. But we've moved out of the Rift Valley and on to the African crystalline basement. You can kind of think of this as the equivalent of the Canadian Shield. So undifferentiated igneous and metamorphic rocks, granites, gneisses, diorites, and so forth. And this African Shield underlies about 40% of sub-Saharan Africa and is home to about half the population of sub-Saharan Africa. And where do you find water? Where do you find water in this type of terrain? Well, I had a pretty good idea because in 1999 and 2000, with my colleague, Dr. Richard Kellett, we carried out a water exploration program sponsored by the German Development Bank in southeastern Malawi, where we sited water wells in 250 villages. And we went into that program not necessarily set on any one technique. First thing we did was identify 23 water wells that had a long history of good production, but were no longer producing because of mechanical failure in the pump. We pulled the pumps, and while the pumps were out of the wells, We took advantage of the PVC casing, and we logged those holes with gamma conductivity susceptibility logs, trying to identify what physical property distinguished the aquifer from everything else. And where do you find water in these crystalline basement aquifers? Well, you find it in what's called saprolite. So saprolite is weathered crystalline rock that's weathered in place. That is, it's chemically weathered. The soluble minerals have been dissolved, and in areas of high precipitation, generally 800 millimeters or so or more of water a year, the precipitation is high enough to saturate the pore space. We don't really have these in Canada because we had glaciers, and the glaciers stripped away these saprolite type of rock. And as you can see here, the conductivity log most diagnostically identifies these saturated saprolite layers. So as in Kakuma, I'd already been to Uganda, northern Uganda, Acholi land, and I carried out, again, a training program where I trained local Acholi people. So unlike the refugees, though, these weren't from the broad educational background that refugees might be. These Acholi people that I was working with, they were largely either child soldiers or returnees that had come back from the internment camps, from the so-called protection camps. And I trained them in hand pump repair, manual drilling, hand pump installation. But I'd also train them in 1D resistivity, not only 1D resistivity acquisition, but interpretation and even inversion. So given that we know electrical methods are our best approach to exploring for water, it actually wasn't a big deal to go back in 2018 with 2D resistivity methods. And these 40 or so Acholi students without any university education were very quick studies and very quickly picked up these techniques. And I'm just going to show you a couple sections. This first section is very typical. This is a 500-meter long section. We're looking about 60 meters deep. We carried out exploration in 20 villages. And what we see here on the right is we see the higher resistivities. That's massive, unweathered crystalline rock. And on the left, we see that wedge, that blue wedge coming in of lower resistivity rock. That's our saturated, weathered crystalline rock, our saprolite. That's our target. Now, at this point, it's 2018. These students had already been manually drilling and repairing hand pumps for 3 or 4 years. They truly knew far more than me at this point. So all I needed to do, and with my colleagues from Canada, we guided them through the geophysics. We helped them with the interpretation, but they didn't need us to drill the wells, install the pumps. But to be certain that the wells would be in exactly the right location, be certain that they could be properly placed without GPS or expensive survey equipment, we created drone photogrammetric images, that is orthophotos, over every village, and we marked the interpreted drill locations on those photos to be certain that the wells would be placed in the right location. And then a few weeks after we left, after we Canadians left, the Acholi students came behind their manual drilling methods, which mimic all the steps of a mud rotary or percussion rig with mud. It just takes longer and has a lot more muscle power, but they can get down through 25, 30 meters of crystalline rock in 3, 4, 5 days. And very, very effective, and obviously very inexpensive. The second and final section I'll show you is a very unusual section. Here again, we're looking at about 500-meter section, looking about 60 meters deep. And the section is bisected by this vertical resistor. And this resistor is an unweathered dike that speaks directly back to those dikes, those unweathered dikes that those Bedouins in the Sinai Desert were looking for. So the dike acts as an underground dam, raising the water table, raising the saturated zone behind the dike, upgrading from the dike, lowering the resistivities, presenting a very clear target. And again, the Acholi students follow behind. They drill the well, they put in the PVC casing, they put in a downhole cylinder, piston cylinder, and then here they're putting a rising main that takes the water from the cylinder to surface. We do some quick water quality checks to make sure the water was potable. We would also take a sample back to Canada for more detailed analyses. And then we would put on a new Uganda 2 hand pump and a cement apron. And that cement apron serves a very important function of drawing the excess water away, moving it off site, preventing these hand pump sites from becoming epicenters of Zika, dengue, malaria, chikungunya, and all those mosquito-borne diseases. So I've spent a lot of time in northern Uganda, and there's over 1 million refugees from South Sudan. And of course, I've also spent a lot of time in the Kakuma refugee camp. That's more than 60% refugees from South Sudan. So I'd heard a lot of stories about the civil war, the violence, the genocide, the mass murder. And of course, I knew that South Sudan was the most dangerous country in the world for humanitarian work with the highest mortality rate. And it was certainly a country I would never go to. But a little more than a year ago, the Red Cross and a small NGO, Groundwater Relief, contacted me. And they said, there wasn't a peace agreement, but there was what they called a cessation of hostility in Jonglei State, which was the ground zero for the civil war. And they wanted to get into some of the more remote villages that had been cut off and develop water supply. So of course I said, sure, why not? So here's a simplified geological map of South Sudan. And the bottom part of the map, we see this band, this taupe-colored band, that's crystalline rock. That's an extension northward from Uganda, from the Congo, of that African crystalline basement. And then we get to that broad expanse of yellow. That's a massive basin, the Sud, that's infilled with hundreds of meters to an unknown thickness of sediment. And the area we were going to work out of is two remote, tiny villages, Hat and Chul, at the northern end of the Sud. So of course we had to fly there, Bell 412, which we packed with tents, living equipment. We forgot all our water filter was broken, small details, but of course the geophysical equipment. And then we flew for 3 hours over the Sud, the largest wetland in the world, larger than the province of Nova Scotia. And not only is it a wetland, but this particular year it was receiving unprecedented flooding. And in fact, I found it darkly humorous when I returned back to Calgary 6 weeks later. I saw this article in BBC, and a number of colleagues contacted me from the AGU. They knew I was working in the Sud, and they said, hey, there's this great paper that identified these small but measurable increases in the greenhouse gas methane in the atmosphere as being due to flooding in the Sud. And for me, this was not the story. It was not a story. The real story, of course, was the flooding itself, the famine due to the flooding, and the ongoing and largely unreported civil war that has claimed more than 400,000 lives in this part of South Sudan. So as in Uganda, I did aerial photography with a drone over every village. And here's a typical villages. We targeted 14 villages in the Sud. And something you probably notice in this photo is that there's a lot of water. There's many tributaries here to the White Nile River. Now, yes, this is the rainy season and the unprecedented flooding, and the water will drop, and the water is not easily accessible. And yes, those wetlands are full of crocodiles. But most importantly, there's no sanitation, there's no hygiene here. All the water you see here is high in E. coli and other pathogens. So really in a cutoff area like this, remote area like this, groundwater is the only safe, sustainable water source. So we didn't know much about this area, but we thought, given the great thickness of fine-grained sediment as you'd expect in this floodplain, we decided to use 2D resistivity to explore for sands and gravels within the floodplain. And we used all female porters to carry our very heavy loads of electronics, cables, electrodes, and other gear through the waist-high, razor-sharp grass, 45, 50-degree heat, knee-deep mud. And where the villages were even more remote, the Red Cross gave me boats and crew to go as far as we could, and then we would walk from there. And I'll just show you a couple sections. The first few sections were very, very disappointed. For instance, in this section, the resistivities are very low, all cool colors, blues and greens, diagnostic of clays from southwest, northeast, top to bottom. But as we carried on exploring, collecting more and more data, we started to find these sands and gravel layers in almost every village and always at the same elevation, well within the capabilities of the small manual drilling rigs that the Red Cross would fly in by helicopter to drill these wells. None of these wells have actually been drilled yet, but the Red Cross is planning a program immediately following the end of the pandemic and their ability to safely access these remote villages. So I flew out late on a Friday afternoon. I flew out in the helicopter. We landed just before dark. I thought I'd be heading home pretty quick. And the Red Cross met me with three things. First, they gave me a gin and tonic, which I appreciated. And then they gave me another gin and tonic. And then they gave me a map of Juba. And Juba is unlike any other capital city in the world I've seen. It's about 500,000 people. There's no centralized water system. There's no centralized sanitation system or hygiene system. In this map, the warmer colors are indicative of higher frequencies of what the government of Sudan calls waterborne diseases, which you can take as cholera. And it's certainly established knowledge that as water availability drops, the frequency of cholera outbreaks increase wherever you go in the world. So the Red Cross wanted to target these neighborhoods that were underserviced in water. So again, we're back in crystalline basement terrain. Like in Uganda, we use 2D resistivity. And I'll just show you one section. And this is through a neighborhood, St. Augustine in downtown Juba. Juba, you can see it's essentially a large village. And an NGO, certainly without any geological knowledge, without any science background, placed this well here. To me, or any good geologist would recognize as a very unlikely place. They drilled right into the crystalline rock. But it was logistically placed here because it's at the intersection of two roadways. Well, in fact, that NGO is a lot smarter than I would have been, or perhaps a lot luckier, but not as smart as the geophysics, because the geophysics shows us that clearly that well was placed in a good location. We have this nice, thick saprolite blanket, and the well has maybe 15, 20 meters of saturated weather dome there. And that well, in fact, has been a good producer for several years. But what we also see in the geophysics is that we have a second target 100 meters to the west, where the saturated zone is twice the thickness. It will likely offer a good producing water well, with more sustainable, that will last well through the dry season. And it will offer a second well that will give relief to that first well. So finally, I'm going to step back in my career to a part of my career Kathy mentioned, to the Boxing Day tsunami in Boxing Day 2004. And I did speak fluent Indonesian then. And of course, I have a background in hydrogeology and geophysics, and UNICEF seconded me to begin the assessment of the impact of the tsunami to Aceh province and begin redevelopment of the water supply. And Aceh was the epicenter of the earthquake. Over 170,000 people were killed in Aceh province alone. So as part of that assessment, this is long before drones, I built a radio-controlled camera that I flew from a kite. And I took this photograph, and it's of a tugboat that was pulling a coal barge from southern Sumatra to Singapore. And the tsunami wave, it was actually 3 waves, lifted the barge and the boat and dropped them right on the coastal highway. So a cool photo, of course, but that's not why I took the photo. The reason I took the photo is that stripped away cliff in the background, that was the first site that was visited within a few days of the tsunami by USGS scientists, because here they can measure the height of the tsunami wave. And it was more than 31 meters at this point. So of course, the entire coastal plain was flooded and seawater reached as far inland as 5 kilometers. And a scene I saw in many of the more than 200,000 shallow hand-dug wells that were inundated in the tsunami, and a scene that was repeated all around the Indian Ocean. Aid workers, again, religious organizations, NGOs, other UN agencies, descended upon these wells, descended upon these villages with powerful pumps, pumping the salt water out of the wells, further drawing in the seawater, discharging the salt water immediately adjacent to the well, cycling that water back in until eventually the wells would collapse and fail. For most aid organizations, a well is simply a hole in the ground. Of course, to a geoscientist and especially a hydrogeologist as well, is much more than that. It's a window into the subsurface geology. It's a window into the broader hydrogeologic environment. And hopefully something you've got out of this talk is that in all these humanitarian crises I've spoke of, they all require tremendous inputs of human resources, of financial support, and incredible logistical support. But what they also require and really receive is scientific input, and especially geoscientific input. And I think what we all see is that the crises of the present, and indeed the crises of the next few years and the next few decades, will also require the input of geoscientists. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge again the Gallagher family, University of Calgary, of course, the CSCG Foundation, Geoscientists Without Borders that funded the Acholi land and Kakuma work, my colleagues at BGC and the Kakuma refugees and the Acholi people who actually did the work, Israel Aid, who supported us logistically in Acholi land and the Kakuma camp, UNHCR, who supported the Bangladesh work, and the Red Cross and groundwater relief that supported the South Sudan work. And I'd also like to acknowledge a few people who supplied me with photographs, including Josie Bauman. And finally, from the Kakuma camp, in one of the few days where the dust isn't so thick that you can actually see the volcanoes rimming the camp, there's more than 50 languages spoken in Kakuma, but the lingua franca there is Swahili. And asante sana to everyone. I appreciate people coming to this Zoom talk. Thank you very much. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the CSCG Foundation. I would especially like to suggest that students take note, because the CSCG Foundation is very focused on supplying scholarships to students, learning subsidies, travel grants, supporting the GeoConvention mentorship program. And you can certainly find many more details on the CSCG Foundation website. And again, to everyone who logged into this, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Paul, for sharing your research and experiences with us this evening. That was just absolutely captivating, and really, honestly, it was truly inspiring. Even though we shouldn't call you it, I think you should be Smiling Paul, because you really have been doing some fantastic work. I know that many of you out there have questions for our speakers. Please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We appreciate all of your questions, but due to limited time, we may not be able to answer all of them. We will do our best to get through as many questions as we can, and we'll try to group similar questions together in order to be more efficient. First question I have here is from Landon Woods, who I think I saw in one of those pictures. Hi, Paul. Thanks for the talk. Do you think that a large enough aquifer exists under that refugee camp in Bangladesh to support the number of people that are there?
So there's about 10 camps. There's about 10 camps in the Taknaf Peninsula. And the camps in the north, there's hundreds of meters of alluvial deposits. And the answer there is yes. The camps in the south, no. I mean, even basic geological mapping, which was done, but it was done incorrectly, would indicate no, that these thick Miocene shales are inadequate for providing the water that's going to be needed to supply camps of this size. I mean, there's also many other problems that are going to be faced in the camps, even the camps in the north where there are multiple aquifers. As you saw, it's a peninsula, the Taknaf Peninsula. And if you pump long enough and hard enough, of course, you'll begin to draw seawater in either from the east or the west. And again, this is an area where any geoscientist, any hydrogeologist would recognize these potential landmines up front at the early establishment of a camp. And regardless of whether saltwater intrusion is a problem down the road, of course, these people need water, but at least you could begin to do precautionary measures of monitoring, of pumping tests, of regular hydrochemical testing. And that's And that's part of the problem I have with many of these humanitarian responses is that, yes, day one after a tsunami, day one after a civil war, the crisis is acute, and maybe week one and month one and year one, but even years after a crisis has occurred, as in the Kakuma camp, most of these agencies still treat these situations as in crisis mode, when they start to have to look at them in a long-term development mode and look at what's going to be needed to supply these people, because whether it's Bangladesh or Kakuma, these camps are generally understood by the host communities to be temporary sites. The average time a refugee spends in a refugee camp is 18.7 years, and the Kakuma camp has been there since 1991. So that's way more of a answer than you asked for, but no, there's not enough water there, and the characterization for long-term water supply has not been done properly.
Thanks, Paul. That was a very thorough answer, and I think it was very much appreciated. So the next question is from both Rachel Lauer and Kathy Ryan. How can professional and budding hydrogeologists engage with these efforts?
Yeah, that's that's the toughest question I always get, and I always dread it a little bit. And I'm going to give you two parts to answer that question. I can tell you, I was actually a little surprised when I got that question at the Colorado School of Mines, because they actually have a graduate program in humanitarian engineering, and I thought they'd be telling me. So again, I'm going to give you way more of an answer than you probably bargained for. And the first part of it's going to be very, very maybe even dour, negative. I'm just going to, it may sound a bit of a hyperbole, but the humanitarian industry, and it is very much an industry, I would say, it's about $30 billion a year is spent on humanitarian work. And 60% of that money, at least 60% of it, goes to only two agencies, UNHCR and World Food Program. And then, another 20-30% goes to the other few multi-billion-dollar agencies, Red Cross, IOM, UNICEF, and it's not much left for those frontline agencies that are actually doing all the work. And it's very much a closed shop. It's hard to break in. And again, this may sound a little bit like hyperbole, but many of these agencies, it's not hyperbole, it's true what I'll say. Many of these agencies, they would feel much more comfortable talking to a rebel, someone who's committed genocide, or some guerrilla organization they have to negotiate with than professionals. And for all kinds of reasons, but the main reason is that I would probably say outside of medical work, that is, for instance, MSF, generally the work being done in these camps, especially in water resources, is not being done by professionals. For instance, at best, running a large water program, you might see someone with a public health background, and more typically it's someone with a logistics background. So it's very much a closed shop, tough to get in. On the other hand, what I would say is that's changing. It's changing very, very quickly, partly because of this epidemic that we're all going in right now. The pandemic is hugely drawing down resources, forcing many of these organizations to recognize that what they have to do, whatever they have to do much more efficiently. They can't afford to drill 5 water wells to get 1 water well. They have to use more local organizations. They have to reduce bureaucracy. So it is changing. And I'll move on from there even a little more, trying to get a little more optimistic as well. What I would also say too is that the best thing you can do, certainly persistence, looking for opportunities. There are websites that have that post hundreds of jobs in the humanitarian sphere, and probably the best one I would say is run by OCHA, the Office of Communication and it's a UN agency, Office of Communication and Humanitarian Administration, and they have a website, Relief Web, all one word. You click on Relief Web, you click on jobs, you click on water and sanitation, you'll see hundreds of jobs. And what you'll see in those jobs is where things are moving. They're moving towards a more technical end. So here's where I come to directly addressing people in school. I would say that don't chase the things that these agencies are looking for right now. Chase the things that you know that they need in the very near future. GIS, data management, hydrogeology, aqueous geochemistry, remote sensing. I think this humanitarian sector is going to move very quickly to becoming much more professionalized, and having those skills, as well as the willingness and the doggedness to get your way into that sector, will get you into the sector. And then again, it's a closed shop. Once you're in, you're in. And yeah, so those are the two aspects of breaking in. I would put out there.
Well, again, a very thorough answer, but certainly very much appreciated, at least from my standpoint. So the next question is from Haidar Putra. What are some of the strategies that your team or the NGOs you worked with used in order to ensure that the wells that they built in the refugee camps are well maintained and long lasting?
Yeah, I mean, all these sites are really different. Yeah, they're all really different. I guess I'll start with Kakuma. So all refugee camps are essentially all the refugee camps in the world, like all the camps that actually are home to official refugees. And I didn't give a number. There's about 80 million refugees in the world, but about 27.5 million of them are official refugees under the Geneva Convention. They're all managed by UNHCR. They have they have generous budgets, but they have budgets of millions of dollars for water and sanitation. And the wells are maintained. They have to be maintained. I mean, one thing the UN is very good at, they're not very good at long-term planning, the long-term understanding, the development, but they're great at keeping people alive. So whatever it takes to keep those wells going, pumping, driving trucks of diesel across the Turkana desert, to paying off rebels to keep those diesel generators going, flying in well pots, they'll do it. But beyond that, there's bi-yearly water chemistry sampling. There's training programs. There's training programs for refugees within the camp to train them to maintain the water systems. And I'm going a little bit off topic here, but the main purpose of the Kakuma program was not to turn these refugees into hydrogeologists, but to give them enough training that they could get jobs with the water and sanitation sectors with the UN within the camps to maintain the water systems. And the point of that is it hugely increased their livelihood, because the rations that they get are barely enough to keep them alive. So anyways, there's hundreds of refugees that work within the WASH programs that are well trained, that maintain the wells. And the UN will do whatever it has to do to keep those wells going. In Uganda, let's go to Uganda. In Uganda, I scratch my head. I really do not know why it was so successful, but saw in contrast the Acholi people that participated in that program. They had very little education. They came out of the internment camp, out of the protection camps, and child soldiers. But necessity is the mother of invention, and every single one of those 40 students that were in the class are far better at hand pump repair, manual drilling than I am. Most of them have gone on to establish their own small companies, water exploration companies, hand pump companies. We've left geophysical equipment there. It's been continually used. I know they've done more than 1,000 1D soundings. They've learned how to do computer inversions. Some of those groups have got contracts from UN and other NGOs to do water exploration for the UN and IDP camps in South Sudan and Ebola camps in the Congo, in displacement camps in Uganda. When we site these water wells, the village engagement is done by the students themselves, and of course, for better or worse, but I would say for better, they do it with villages that they're from or they have family, so they know when there's problems and there's pumps, and they're right on top of returning to those villages and repairing those pumps. There was all kinds of components to this program beyond what I spoke of. Pumping tests. We did stable isotope analysis, oxygen and deuterium, to get a sense of where the water was coming from. Is the water, are the aquifers sustainable? We certainly look at rainfall patterns and rainfall gauges and rainfall history. Yeah, so there's and I can tell you, I'm still in touch with many of the people in this program. I'll just say one other thing. I do have a grant to go back there again in January, and we're always looking at ways to make these systems more sustainable. And something we're looking at this time is to put in accelerometers into the hand pumps that would communicate to by telemetry to the actual hand pump mechanics in Gulu, so they would know. Not only would they know when the pump's not working, but they would know when the pump is starting to not work or not working as efficiently, because they would see that it's taking more and more strokes to get the same amount of water. So so yeah, there's a few more sites I could go into, but that's already, again, more of an answer than you probably wanted.
Oh, still great. Thank you very much. So next question is from Maureen McLeod. And I think you did mention the GRACE satellites in your talk, but I think her question is general, so you sort of zoomed in. But on a general term, like, so how much do we know about how much available water is out there in aquifers around the world?
Well, the data from the GRACE satellites tells us that I think 21 of the 31 or 32 large regional aquifers at or beyond their tipping points. So so certainly the large aquifers in the world are being stressed. Now of course there's much more to say than that, and the devil is in the details. So for instance, of course, the GRACE satellites data, they're just looking at unconfined data. They're not looking at confined aquifers, but also they're only looking at the largest of the aquifers, and there's a lot of much smaller aquifers that are stressed, and on and on. And I'm certainly not a researcher on the GRACE program, and actually there's a leading researcher, Jay Farmaglietti, out of University of Saskatchewan. But the general consensus, I will sum that up concisely. The general consensus is that we're in trouble, that water resources around the world, as determined from GRACE, are stressed and becoming increasingly so. And of course, that's likely of no surprise to many people that are listening in this lecture.
Great, thank you very much. So continuing with that theme of measuring water in aquifers, we have two geophysicists in the audience, Dave Eaton and Mike Hall. Dave Eaton asks, would airborne EM potentially be an efficient way to do reconnaissance on these areas for groundwater? And then Mike Hall asks, would pure P and S waves be suitable as well?
I'll answer the first question first, and I'll even maybe tell a little bit of a story in that first question. The short of it is absolutely yes. And that 1990-1991 program, Richard Keller and I did in Malawi, I mean, it was very clear to us from the borehole geophysics that airborne, with a airborne EM program, we could map all of Malawi. And we actually put together, 1991, we put together an unsolicited proposal to CEDA, Canadian International Development Agency, to map airborne EM over the entire country of Malawi, essentially map all the aquifer potential of the whole country, $1 million. It was rejected. It was tossed out. And then a year later, I mean, I very vividly remember listening to the news. A year later, there was a brutal drought in Malawi. It was the cause, and it was the catalyst for the book, the Boy Who Harnessed the Wind, and the movie. Anyways, there was a drought in Malawi, and Canada was flying. I think it was at $1 million each flight, C-130s taking over rice or some other grain that nobody even eats over there, and lauding itself as helping out in the famine, where clearly a countrywide water mapping program would have been much more beneficial. And, there's a lot of things you can take out of that, but on the broader context, I can tell you, generally aid organizations, whether they're big government organizations or small NGOs, they don't particularly like geophysics on its own, because you do this $1 million airborne program and they say, where is the water? They'd rather drill 9 dry holes and 1 water well. But the answer is absolutely yes. I'll expand on that a little bit. Something probably some of the geophysicists in the audience noticed, but maybe not, because I flashed it by so fast. The conductivity log was where clearly gave the best anomaly over the saprolite zone. But the magnetic susceptibility log was also really good, especially considering that was on a log scale. And so we considered doing magnetics, but of course, electrical methods are sensitive to water saturation. But nevertheless, now, considering that clearly these aquifers these saprolite zones have different magnetic susceptibilities, and nowadays, where you can fly incredibly high resolution magnetometers from tiny drones at 40 kilometers an hour, and I know this because we're doing this. Magnetics is something that also should be reconsidered now as an exploration technique for water exploration. Of course, magnetics may also pick up fracture zones, faults, and so forth. So the answer to your question is absolutely yes. Yeah, I didn't fully understand that PNS wave question. I will say in Kakuma, and whenever we do use seismic refraction for water exploration, we also do MASW. That is, we process the data for the shear velocities as well, hoping we will get shear velocity information that will tell us about fracturing in the bedrock, as well as the second definition of top of bedrock. I didn't talk about that at all because we have not found it useful at all, but we collect it, we process it, and we're always looking to use that data. But if I didn't answer your question, please rephrase it.
Thanks, Paul. So next question is from Lynn Forrest. Thank you for an inspirational talk, Paul. How did you find water in Indonesia with all the existing waters or wells filled with salt water?
Yeah, again, I'll make too big a story, but I'll come back to basic. So I came to Aceh in April. So this is already 4 months after the tsunami, and there are already many NGOs drilling. Not having worked in Indonesia, I certainly knew a bit how the system worked and where to find things. And of course, this is before it was 2004. It's 17 years ago, and so I was shocked to see that nobody had maps, and not topographic maps, not hydrogeology maps. So the first thing I did was go to Java, to the Geological Survey at Indonesia, and they gave me this huge catalog of maps, including lots of subsurface maps that had already mapped out most of the aquifers in that region. So along that coastal plain in Sumatra, there's many confined aquifers. So the real importance of the geophysics was not so much water exploration, but was delineating the saltwater intrusion front. And there was some surface geophysics done in support of that, but the main and most useful effort that was done to support that was a Aceh-wide, or at least all the flooded areas, but let's call it an Aceh-wide airborne EM survey that was done by the German Geological Survey. And I've spoken with a number of those researchers, when I see them now and then in conferences since, and we're always scratching our heads together because the data is spectacular. It's truly spectacular, but in fact, very few NGOs really made any use of it. But again, the short of it is the basic geological maps, hydrogeological maps that were already in place with the Indonesian Geological Survey had plenty of information to supply targeting for aquifers along the coast.
Thank you. So the next question is from Jack Goodwin. Could you please give your thoughts on combining this sort of water finding through hydrogeology with the above ground solutions of water management for sanitation and gardening?
Yeah, I mean, that's a That's a big question. That's a huge question. I guess the short of it is, and maybe the standard answer you get from anyone working in the humanitarian sector is the water supply portion and the sanitation portion, they go hand in hand. And you know, I think I partially illustrated that in the example from Juba, where clearly without enough water, the sanitation sector having water supply is critical to having proper sanitation and hygiene. Of course, we're seeing that again. We're seeing that in this pandemic. You know, more broadly, your question. Actually, I'm gonna focus it right down to Kakuma again. I just finished a project for the World Bank where I mean, it initially sounded completely crazy to me, but the UN agencies, the World Bank, they again, it's very recent. They're coming to this realization that most of these big refugee camps, they're not going anywhere. They're staying there, and even countries like Kenya that forbid anything that would create permanency now realize these camps aren't going anywhere. There is an underground economy. We're losing out on this tax revenue. So they go to the World Bank, UN. Okay, fix it. We want create an economy here. So the World Bank, they have this idea that growing peanuts in Kakuma is the way to a cash economy. And of course, there are some sane reasons to it, but anyways, they want to grow peanuts, groundnuts they call it in Africa. And but of course, where are you going to get water? I mean, sure, we found these wells and there's enough water now for the camp. They get their 20 liters per person per day, but is there enough water in the middle of the desert for agriculture? And I think what you have to do is, you know, here's where it more broadly answers your question. You have to look at all possibilities. So groundwater is great for supplying the camp. You can have, you know, a dozen big water wells, centralized water sources. You can distribute the water. You can put the wells more or less where you need them. You can chlorinate them. Agriculture, you have to think more broadly. So in putting together this report, we looked at dams on the trash. We looked at what are called slow dams that will trap flash floodwaters and induced infiltration. We looked at recharging flash floodwaters, recharging into the aquifers. We looked at capturing rainfall, spate irrigation, where you channel the waters into open lands that are already been planted. So yeah, I mean, going from enough water, and that's what I like about humanitarian work. Like, I don't have to mess around with my mind about the complications of what if these people just simply need water to live. But as you start to think about agriculture, gardens, cash economies, supplying food for themselves, yeah, you have to get a lot more creative and look at a broader range of water sources, and of course tie that with what kind of crops you're going to grow and the markets and the soils and climates and all those other aspects.
Thank you very much for that one. So the next one from Alan Cantor: what have been the most significant technical or non-technical developments or innovations that have emerged since you began your career and that have enabled you to do the phenomenal work that you do?
You know, they're all happening. I mean, I think, you know, going back to the very first question about how do you get into this humanitarian sector, you know, one thing everyone in school should keep in mind: you're at school at, it may not seem so, but you're at in school at a very privileged time where there's this explosion of uses of digital data and remote sensing and analytics and information and you know, for instance, even the GRACE satellites, they've been flying for a long time, but it's only recently that the data has been processed and interpreted. So you know, what are the most significant? There's a lot of them. I mean, remote sensing is huge. Of course, geophysics is massive. And you know, there's only so many physical properties to measure, but the ability to measure these physical properties with equipment that's become so much more portable, so much quicker, with laptops that we can go out in the field and process the data and come up with the interpretations. You know, there's new techniques, nuclear magnetic resonance, the first and only technique that directly sees water and only sees water. Telemetry for providing remote sensing, you know, just positioning, the ability to figure out where you are with GPS and to confidently relocate yourself or relocate a drill rig. The you know, if anyone's ever seen the movie The Good Lie, you know, they somewhat laugh at these refugees because, you know, they've literally never seen a flush toilet, they've never been in a car, they don't know how to open a door. But and there's still some of that in Kakuma, but they all have cell phones now. They are, and in those cell phones, they all have GPSs, they all can take photographs. So yeah, everything is changing so quickly, and it's exciting. It's actually a great time to be in the geosciences, I think.
Excellent, thank you. So for the next question, an anonymous attendee asks, for the water exploration surveys, were you able to establish primary flow direction from anything like a previous hydrogeologic survey, or were you basing it just on the geophysics surveys? Was there cooperation from local geological survey folks or not?
Yeah, so, you know, one thing I didn't, you know, the Uganda and the Turkana programs, I mean, they look really successful as I laid them out here, and they were, but it looks like we drop in for 11 days, we save the world, and we disappear. And you know, but I would say that's certainly not the case. Part of the reason, for instance, the Kakuma program and all these programs is going back again and again, a long period of involvement. I mean, in Kakuma, you know, there's well over 100 reports on water exploration that had been written. There was a PhD thesis and a master's thesis. I read everything. I can tell you, when I went to Malawi, and you know, there wasn't much on the internet, the first place I went was the Gallagher library to get a geological map. And so yeah, there's huge amount of upfront work before going to these places. You know, I hate to say this, but generally there isn't much cooperation from the local government surveys. And again, I for various reasons. I mean, you know, for instance, in Acholi land, I mean, not only have NGOs and the UN and most of these aid organizations largely abandoned the North, but the government has largely abandoned the North, and that's you know, but that's fine. That's why I go to these places, because they need me. And but you know, and it's something I see not just in the humanitarian sector, but I can tell you I see it in archaeology, working with archaeologists. You know, in many aspects, knowledge is power, and so you know, be more precise. In Acholi land, in all over Uganda, the European Union did these very good hydrogeology reports over every district in Uganda, and they did one over Acholi land, and I called the water survey in Uganda, and they wouldn't give me the report because they said it was proprietary, it was confidential. So I called the German in Germany who authored the report, and he wouldn't give it to me without permission from the Uganda survey. And of course I got the report. I found someone who knew somebody but generally cooperation from local governments it's often very, very difficult. And you know, part of it is the same wall that you face with a lot of NGOs and even UN agencies. Having said that, I will also say that however difficult it is, you have to cooperate. You have to work with UN, for instance, in any refugee camp, because they run the places, and you have to work with the local governments because of course, not only is it their country, but you want to be there to build their capacity, not undermine the capacity. So So, I mean, the short answer to what you're saying is how does it happen with a lot of patience, a lot of frustration, and I have a bit of a mantra that I often say to myself. I try to remind myself why am I there, and who am I trying to help, and I just got to take that actually a little bit further. Is you know, some of you might be rolling your eyes and maybe thinking either I'm a little sarcastic, that's terrible. It works so that way in these African countries or whatever. But look at us. I mean, we're this country. We a year ago we had over 200 boiled water advisories on, and some of these boiled water advisories have been on indigenous lands for decades. And there I would say it's the same thing. Like you know, you have to work with the governments, but at the same time, I think the best way to approach some of these problems is the same thing as same kind of model I was using in Uganda. You try to work from the top down, but you also work from the bottom up. You work with the locals, you train them, you toss out all these paternalistic ideas. You recognize that even child soldiers and people who grew up in IDP camps, they can be just as smart or 10 times smarter than you. They can learn given the opportunities, and they're way more motivated than you are, because it's their villages and their water supplies and their lives.
Thank you, Paul, very much. And I'm sorry to all of our attendees who asked questions so we don't have time to answer, but I think one last lighthearted question might be good to close out the night. So Mark Kavanaugh picked up on the fact that you said that you speak, or at least spoke, fluent Indonesian. So perhaps you could say so long in Indonesian to close out the night.
Yeah, selamat malam. Terima kasih, selamat malam. Thank you very much, and good night.
Great. So yeah, I will. It's been a pleasure being with you here tonight and being able to participate in this Gallagher presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Steve Hubbard.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Ben. I am Steve Hubbard. I'm the interim head in the Department of Geoscience. To start these closing remarks, I promise to be fairly brief here, but I obviously need to thank Paul. What an inspirational talk. Your experiences have been obviously incredible, and we appreciate you sharing them with our community. It's really something else. I'd also, at this point, like to thank the Gallagher family again for their ongoing support of this public series. Our students, our faculty, staff, alumni, we're all made richer by being able to learn from world-class researchers and scientists like Paul. If you're interested in supporting our research or any other faculty initiatives, please visit our faculty website at science.ucalgary.ca. We will include the link for this in our post-event survey. And tonight's lecture is the last one in our winter 2021 lineup. The Gallagher Colloquium series will return in the fall, so check our series website and your email closer to September for details. And I also want to point out that if you do want to receive Faculty of Science event invitations, you can also email SCI alumni @ucalgary.ca. And on that note, a couple upcoming events. On Thursday, March 25th, the Faculty of Science, in partnership with COSIA, is hosting a virtual panel discussion titled Raising the Bar on Sustainable Wetlands. This noon-hour event is open to alumni and the entirety of our community. So registration details can be found at science.ucalgary.ca. Also, our students in the Department of Geoscience are hosting the annual Geoscience Research Exchange, or GeoRex, on Friday, April 9th. This is a full-day event. There'll be poster sessions, and it'll also feature a keynote presentation by Dr. Sinti Lee of Rice University, who studies how our planet has evolved with time from the mantle all the way to the atmosphere. So another great talk in store. The event is again open to all of you. So again, details to be found at ucalgary.ca/conferences/GeoRex. Your feedback is important. We want to hear from you. So this post-event survey includes some additional questions to help us plan next year's series. Planning indeed is already underway. To make something this great, it does take a lot of work, but it's so satisfying after seeing, again, such a great lineup of talks capped off here with Paul. So please take a moment to share your thoughts about what you've seen and what you'd like to see. The link to give will be included in the survey in case you're interested in doing so. And again, thank you all for joining us for this year's Gallagher Colloquium series. We look forward to having you join us for the fall series, and enjoy the rest of your evening.